civilizations, and we are starting with Mesopotamia. We are starting with Mesopotamia, ancient river civilizations. So we just started talking about how civilizations formed because of agriculture. So these are the different civilizations that we start to occur, some of the first ones, the most complex ones, and we are starting with Mesopotamia. So where is Mesopotamia? Mesopotamia is a land that is referred to as the land between rivers, and it's located south of the Fertile Crescent. And so it's called the land between two rivers because, or the land between rivers, because it is between two major rivers. It is between two major rivers. And like we talked about, this made agriculture very easy. So they were able to use these rivers to irrigate different land, and their land is going to be very productive for agriculture because of these rivers, because it has easy access to water. And so these two rivers are the Tigris River and the Euphrates River. The Tigris River and the Euphrates River. So Mesopotamia is between the Tigris and Euphrates. It is home to the earliest ancient civilization. It is home to the earliest ancient cities, city-states, and empires. It is home to the earliest cities, city-states, and empires. And so this is where we first start to see these kinds of societies, these kinds of civilizations form in Mesopotamia. The climate of Mesopotamia. The climate is actually rather dry and arid. They only receive about 10 inches of rain per year. We talked about that when we talked about different climate types. Dry climate types get about 10 inches or less. And that makes the rivers essential for their agriculture and their civilization. Because like we talked about, civilizations are built off of the ability to have a complex agriculture. And so the rivers become very important. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers will flood unpredictably. So they don't decide when these rivers are going to flood. It is not easy for them to decide. And so that is what unpredictable means. They're flooding at different times of the year. The flooding of the rivers is violent, which means, it's flooding everywhere. It's flooding over the sides. The flooding leaves behind silt. And silt is fertile soil. Silt is fertile soil. It makes it very good for agriculture. And so this silt they're using for their plants, their crops, and the flooding leaves behind that silt. And that's like this soil that they are able to use that has been brought up from the flooding. And it's essential for farming that would take place there. Because it's a dry and arid climate, they need that flood to give them fertile land for their crops. Fertile just means it's easier to grow things using that soil. Religions of Mesopotamia. Since Mesopotamia is home to several civilizations, the religion details vary, but they do have some things in common. So Mesopotamia wasn't just one city, it wasn't just one city-state, one civilization, it was a few different ones. And so their religions are a little bit different, but they do have these core common beliefs when it comes to their religion. They were polytheistic. Polytheistic is the belief in multiple gods. So they believed in more than one god, they worshiped to more than one god, and that is what polytheistic means. Poly means many, and theistic is it's a core word used for describing religion. And so they worship many gods. That's what polytheistic means. Many believe the gods created humans to serve their needs. They created humans to serve their needs. And this would require sacrifices. That's why they had priests, and they worshipped in temples called ziggurats. They worshipped in temples called ziggurats. So this is their form of religion. They believed in many gods, and they needed to sacrifice to their gods so that their gods would do what they wanted, so that their gods would be pleased with them and give them what they needed. Some examples of their gods and goddesses. These are different examples, and these are some of the different civilizations too. And so in Babylon, they worshipped Marduk. In the Akkadian civilization, they worshipped Shamash. The Sumerians worshipped Nisaba, and the Assyrians would worship Ashur. And so these are different gods that they would worship. And so, like I said, their religions are different, but there are similarities. So what are some things you notice about these gods and goddesses? There are some similarities, right, in how they appear. And so those common things that they shared are very important in the history of Mesopotamia. Governments of Mesopotamia. So we've talked about different aspects of what is included in a civilization. So far we've talked about their religion. When we're talking about government, that's one of those 8 things that we've talked about civilizations all have. Governments of Mesopotamia. There were many different Mesopotamian governments, just as there were many different civilizations, but they had some things in common. They had social hierarchies. Again, that is something that we agreed in our last unit that pretty much all civilizations start to have: a social hierarchy, a monarchy. They had one ruler, one king, one queen, one emperor. That is what a monarchy is, where you have one ruler at the head of your government. Most of them were peasant farmers. Most of their people were peasant farmers. And so they had this social hierarchy with their ruler, their one ruler, the person in charge of their monarchy at the top, and they would have different social classes within this social hierarchy. So here in this example, we see the ruler at the top, and that is followed by priests and scribes because they valued their religion quite a bit. And so their priests were considered higher in social class. And then they have merchants and skilled workers. So those are people that, they might train for their job. They're people that are selling things that people need. And then you have farmers. So that's where the majority of the population is. And that not bottom class, because they're not slaves, which is at the bottom. Slaves were at the bottom in these kinds of civilizations. So the farmers aren't quite at the bottom, but that's where the majority of your people are going to be. So this is like a pyramid. So you have the one person at the top, and then as you go down, the populations through farmers get a little bit larger, and then slaves are at the very bottom. So you have one ruler, you might have a small group of priests, and then your group of merchants and skilled workers will be a little bit bigger than your priests, but the majority of those people are going to be the farmers and unskilled workers, or the slaves who were at the bottom of the pyramid. So governments continued. We're still talking about governments, right? So ancient Mesopotamia has one of the first codified, written down systems of law. So that's what that means. It means to be written down. And so this is actually something that is still able to be seen today. There is parts of Hammurabi's code that we are able to view today. Hammurabi was a Babylonian emperor. So Babylonia was Babylon, sorry, messed up there. Babylon was one of the civilizations in Mesopotamia. Hammurabi was one of the rulers of the Babylonian Empire. So he was an emperor. He was their one ruler. And he had this code written in cuneiform and posted it throughout the empire. Cuneiform was their system of writing. We've talked about how they have different writing systems in civilizations, how each civilization has a writing system. Cuneiform was the form of writing in the Babylon Empire. And so they had this code written out, and it was created around 1754 BCE. So that's a very long time ago. And so this has been able to survive. That way, these are one of those artifacts that we can study and learn about history through. And so the code goes through all the different like laws that people were expected to follow. And this is something that we can study as historians and look at and understand things about their civilization and what kinds of things they valued and what things they didn't value as much through their law system. So we're going to talk about some of these laws. Hammurabi's code was 282 laws inscribed on pillars. The laws were depicted as given by the god Shamash to Hammurabi. What kinds of things do we notice about these laws? Why do you think these punishments are so severe? Because their punishments were very severe. And so these are different scenarios that we're going to go over. If a man put out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. That's where you get the saying, an eye for an eye, right? So their punishment is equal to whatever they may have done. So if they cut a guy's eye out, their eye is going to be cut out too. If a boy would strike, which means to hit, if a boy would hit his father, the boy's hands or fingers would be cut off. So because you hit your father with your hand, they're going to cut your hand off. That way you can't do it again. If a doctor operates on a patient and the patient dies, the doctor's hands will be cut off. And so his hands were responsible for operating on that patient, so they're going to cut his hands off because the patient died. An injury to a rich man brought a more severe penalty than to an injury to a poor man. And so this is showing you how social class was important in Babylonian society. An injury to a rich man brought a more severe penalty than the injury to a poor man. So if you injured a rich man, you were going to get a more severe, a more harsh punishment than if you were to injure a poor man. And so they're showing you they really valued social class in Babylonian society. The culture and language of Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is home to the earliest known writing system, and that is cuneiform. We talked about cuneiform just a minute ago when we were talking about the code and how it was written. It was written in cuneiform. Cuneiform means wedge-shaped. It means wedge-shaped, and they use this as their system of writing in the Babylonian Empire. And so they created this using reeds pressed into clay tablets. And so these tablets they could write into. It is thought to have been first used to keep records. So things like their laws, that would be keeping a record. That way they could post it throughout their empire. They could post the different laws and keep a record of those laws. It also included poetry, literature, religious writings, and epics. Which we'll talk about some more. So these things were all different ways that cuneiform could be used in. The Epic of Gilgamesh. An epic is a long poem. And so one of the greatest cultural achievements of Mesopotamia is the Epic of Gilgamesh. And so an epic is a long poem, like I said, and one of the most famous is the Epic of Gilgamesh. It was written around 2100 BCE. It was written around 2100 BCE. That is super duper old, right? So old. That is before year zero. So if you worked backwards, that's before zero even comes around. And we are in 2000. So super old. Epics tell a great deal about what the Mesopotamians valued and believed. They talked a lot about what Mesopotamians valued and believed. Different technology that was incorporated in Mesopotamian society. We talked about irrigated fields in our last unit. And so in Mesopotamia, they have access to these great rivers. And so, of course, they're going to irrigate their fields. They're going to irrigate their fields and produce 3 varieties of crops, which are barley, dates, and sesame seeds. Those are their three main crops. They built canals and different drainage systems, different water-related things, because canals they could use for transportation, drainage systems. If their rivers are constantly flooding, they want to be able to keep their cities dry, right? Even though you want great agriculture, you don't want your city, your home, your houses to flood. So they would build different drainage systems, different kinds of dams. That way they could block the river from even flooding into their city. They developed cuneiform writing, like we talked about, writing systems. That is a form of technology because that is the way that they'll be able to record what they're doing. They invented the wheel. This is where we get the wheel. And so, they talk about how old the wheel is, and it is super old. It was invented during the time of Mesopotamian civilizations. They use a surplus of food to steadily increase population and the formation of city-states, little farms, towns, and cities growing into larger populations. So the surplus of food led to steady increase of population and the formation of city-states. The first cities of the world, that is what Mesopotamia is most famous for. This is where we see our first cities of the world. In terms of what we know about history, this is where everything started with cities. Cities formed a division of labor, which eventually led to a social hierarchy, and that's part of what we have talked about, what you have to have for a civilization. And so Mesopotamia is really one of the great ancient river civilizations, and it is the oldest. This is where we start seeing things form, and during class, I'll probably give more examples on these, so make sure you're still staying tuned during class time. We will be doing retakes of our tests this week, our Agricultural Revolution test, so pay attention to your announcements, check into class, that way you can get access codes to the quiz, and I will see you in class.